This is a quick skim through the waste sector from the perspective of Pamela Allen, who has been involved in waste and environmental management, environmental planning more generally for a very long time in various capacities in state and local government in New South Wales, including a stint as minister, and still sits on a planning panel in southern New South Wales. So thank you very much, Pam, for all this material. Pam started out by talking about Craig Rucastle and how he recently won a Silver Logie for his work on War on Waste in the documentary section, and about how important it is to really bring this issue to the fore, because for a long time there hasn't been much action in the waste sector, and really all that's happened is that bins have got a little bit fancier, but in some ways our waste stream is steadily getting worse. So you'll all be familiar with this kind of waste pyramid. Sometimes it's up the other way, where really what we're trying to do is to avoid having the waste in the first place, even though actually a lot of our waste gets disposed of. Because it has environmental impacts all the way along the food chain, and this is a recycling plant on fire, a relatively recent photo, and part of a suite of problems to do with the waste stream. This is a photo of the Longford tyre stockpile in Tasmania. Tyres are particularly difficult to recycle, but nevertheless it's not a good indicator, not a good reflection on Tasmania and Tasmania's poor management of the waste sector at the moment, that this tyre stockpile, it continues to grow, and every now and again, like the previous shot, catches on fire, which of course makes an awful mess, like this. This year has been interesting because China has changed its recyclables that it accepts from Australia, and so China has been the market for almost half of Australia's recyclables. Sorry, that quote got cut off there. And this has changed. So China still does take some of Australia's recyclables, but it's really cut down, and it's really shaking up not just Australia but many nations who used to send a lot of their waste to China, really shaking things up. So the government's quite good at putting out reports, even if it's not terribly good at action, and here's a recent one with a catchy title, Never Waste a Crisis, the waste and recycling industry in Australia, that looks at this issue of what on earth we're going to do with our recycling now that the model of sending goods to China has been thoroughly disrupted. There's been a discussion paper, which apparently it's not really worth reading, that's good on talk and in discussing things and not terribly good on actions, but nevertheless, this just harks back to some of the history of waste and policy around it, and that even though we're in 2018, in 2009 there was a national waste policy that hasn't really amounted to much. So the new idea in this sector is about a circular economy, and even though it's not really a new idea, and a lot of countries have been doing this for a long time and trying to close loops and stop this one-way flow of raw materials being directed into landfill, incinerated sites and other kind of undesirable places for very valuable materials to end up. A circular economy is where you close that loop and try to restore and regenerate materials, either through new technologies that are able to pull materials apart and reuse them, or some other different take on this whole linear economy at the moment, where we're taking natural primary resources, raw materials, making something and then getting rid of it. So the triangle is being quickly replaced by something that looks more like this, where we're trying not to have such a vast flow of raw materials and instead keeping things within our economy. So Pam's point here was that even though this might seem a bit new, it's not new. There's all sorts of references to things not being wasted a long time ago, including a little bit more recently, this one in 1736, a Scot who found himself exiled in Holland and noted on how frugal they are. And this is reflected today in the Netherlands being really ahead of the game in terms of a circular economy, and being the focus of the European Union's efforts. So Pam's point here was that this hasn't happened overnight in Holland, and it has taken a couple of centuries of a different kind of culture and education system and a set of norms that's different to what we've got in Australia. This is about fashion, in particular Burberry. Here's a couple of well-known faces wearing an awful lot of Burberry, and how they're trying, because they've got so much flack about burning all their excess clothes. One of the ways in which Burberry maintains its high-end brand is that any stock that's not sold gets burned, not recycled or sent to op shops or somewhere else for sale. It gets burned. So they're working with this company called Worn Again, and you don't need to know any of the details to try to address this problem, and the degree to which they're successful remains to be seen, and the degree to which this kind of thinking flows through to the vast bulk of our material flow, like literally materials, clothing, through our economy remains to be seen. So the Dutch have got all sorts of ways of dealing with this, and one of this is libraries, tool libraries, clothes libraries, where you don't have to own things and chuck them away, you can borrow them, and when they don't fit or you don't like them anymore, you take them back. This is happening a little bit. So this is an example from Australia, that's what I meant to say, actually from Tasmania, where things aren't being reused like in the previous example, but this is where a couple of women who originate from Melbourne are taking the refuse from a woolen mill in Tasmania and turning it into this high-end recycled wool blankets that are very expensive but very lovely, and yeah, making a boutique product out of something that was previously waste. So at the not boutique end of town, in Georgetown, is a company called Envoronex, and they are trying to recycle a whole lot of things that are not easy to recycle, like high density polyethylene, polypipe, kind of things that come from fish farms, and turn them into products that can be reused. So this kind of thing, there's a series of slides here where products that previously went to landfill are being turned into useful products, and even recycling bins themselves are being collected and turned into useful products. Yeah, all sorts of things, oyster trays. So this is a particular challenge because at the moment a lot of silage that wraps around hay that's fed to livestock is being burnt, and it's easier and it's cheaper. So the current Envoronex challenge is to gather this up, and they're looking for cooperation from local councils here in terms of encouraging farmers and maybe even having places that farmers can bring silage to drop it off, silage wrap to drop it off, so that it can be recycled into new products rather than burnt or sent to landfill. Another product, this time from fish processing, low density polyethylene. Yeah, look, the list is depressingly endless. Over 6,000 tonnes of fishing nets are sent to landfill each year, in Australia, that should say. So again, we don't want these floating around the ocean, and we don't want them in landfill either. So if they can be recycled, that's great. So there's a noticeable lack of action and strategic policy in Tasmania. So not much has changed since 2009. There has been recent efforts to respond to this China crisis, including a waste and recycling roundtable that was chaired by the Tasmanian Minister for the Environment, Elise Archer, but it's very soft in its recommendations. And even though the new statewide waste action plan proposes a container refund scheme, it's only a proposal at the moment to consider an initiative rather than anything a little bit more hard-hitting. So look, I guess it's good to see action, but given the enormity of the problem, this is pretty soft. Container deposit schemes are slowly coming in. So the figure that you probably can't see on here is on average 3 million containers are returned daily at 682 return points of a total of an eventual 800 return points in New South Wales. These will come into Tasmania. There's a proposal for 60 of them. And yeah, if you've got a PayPal account, your 10-cent refund goes to your account. So things are slowly moving, but unlike in South Australia that have had a deposit system for a long time, the rest of the country is really slow to catch up, and Tassie is ways behind. A couple of books that Pam says are easy reads with cute titles: The Wasted City and The Well-Tempered City. She recommends reading them. The point on this slide was that China has actually, through its current and previous 5-year plans, committed to the circular economy, and obviously there's lots of undesirable things happening in China and as part of China's economy that's pretty undesirable, but this is really good to see. So the text at the top reads, current and previous 5-year plans commit to circular economy, focus on domestic green waste, construction, textile waste and recycling, and trying to be frugal in terms of over-packaging, food waste, over-consumption, single-use disposable products, bikes and public transport waste. Just a quote from a report just emphasising how China's attention is shifting to this circular economy in terms of energy, deploying digital technologies through things like smart cities. Big challenges, but that are being addressed. India too has a pretty good system compared to what we have here. This point of this slide is to show Sri Lanka in terms of being roughly the same size as Tasmania, and so getting a sense of how big India is. And so this book talks about the waste sector in India and how different it is to here and how well things are sorted. So here's a kabadiwala, somebody whose job it is to collect and sort waste. And so a quote from the Waste of a Nation book, there's daily collection, there's payment of people who pick through waste, there's organised composting to send it to animals, good segregation of recyclables, cooperation with traders, and this ends up in cleaner spaces, better hygienic conditions, and how important the whole social and cultural side of waste management is in India and how much better that is done than it is done here. A couple of people who work in the waste sector with uniforms, part of a recognised and, I don't know whether to say valued, but a really critical role in Indian waste sector. So this is a relatively recent photo of McDonald's in South Launceston, showing the opposite of what you just saw from India, where McDonald's was demolished, all the building materials heaped up in a big pile, and trucks brought in to take it to landfill. So not only did this all end up in landfill and not get sorted, but we also have no idea in terms of auditing what was here and what could have been diverted and what was going to end up in landfill anyway. This is from Bali. Anybody who's been to Bali might be familiar with a scene like this. Obviously, cows end up ingesting a bit of plastic, which isn't great, but yeah, different system to what we have here. Where the Balinese do sort through in a much more thorough way and segregate and recycle in a way that we don't. I know there's lots of words here and a few of them have slipped off to the right, but New South Wales planning system has a few key principles with respect to waste. The state government looks at a lot of applications to do with large waste facilities. Obviously, having listened to the War on Waste, some of this is not working, but there is no overall strategic planning for waste and hasn't been a plan for waste. So, you know, some of this is of concern in terms of lack of that strong context that would encourage people to do the right thing. Pamela sits on a planning panel in New South Wales. She chairs the panel, and so she was saying in terms of the development control, the panel's expectations are pretty high in terms of people communicating with data, the context, and the kind of process that they've gone through, and that everything's above board. And she included this photo here, the image here of a girl who's apparently called Blowtorch Girl, because the panel are bringing their blowtorch to bear on proposals. If it's not done, and this will be familiar from our wider conversations in EIA, if conversations about waste management facilities and changes such as introducing more incineration are not done well, this is what you get, where there's increasing anxiety from the public to the point where, you know, it can get really out of control. This is not about waste, but, you know, it does need to be managed carefully. And so part of this is SEA, Strategic Environmental Assessment, and strategic planning more generally. So this is where Tasmania is really crying out for strategic planning around waste. And there are all sorts of interesting things that we can do here at the university as a little mini city with our own strategic planning with waste. And as I speak, it's October 2018. The university is currently drafting a waste management strategy and would like input in terms of students doing projects that look at waste management. So if you are interested, please do get in contact with me, because this is a big focus at the University of Tasmania for the next 12 months. So strategic planning is that outer part of a good planning system that informs the selection of tools and infrastructure, the thinking about the really big picture and how everything needs to glue together. Strategic planning, I'll read this because some of the words have slipped off the side and I can't get the framing quite right. Strategic planning is future oriented and presents a narrative of an intended place or set of circumstances for the future. The strategic plan sets out the preferred scenario for a region, shire, town or place around which a delivery platform like an local environment plan and a comprehensive infrastructure plan is developed. So this is where we think about where we are now. We figure out, you know, what the pressures are, what we want as a society, where we want to be, and then taking that input, that context, that vision, that community desire, we figure out how we get there through an action plan. We implement that action plan and we monitor it to see how we're making progress. So in the waste sector in Australia generally and Tasmania in particular, not happening. Again, another schematic from strategic planning in New South Wales. everything should be connecting together, and how as a nation we signed up to all sorts of international agreements that we may not be enacting particularly well on a local level. And local is often where things really come to a head, where something specific like the high level waste disposal out at Copping, desperately unpopular amongst people who live near it, understandably so, but this is the pointy end of making waste strategies work and making decisions. Final word about strategic planning and how it happens. You don't need to know the detail of this, but to say again, thank you so much, Pan, for coming in and running us through this. I know you've got deep expertise in the waste sector, and we really appreciate you giving up your time.